fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
And it's like, well, what else can we do? You know, there's other things we could do. And the ironic thing is that if you behave more like an idiot, you will get further than the most well-laid mastermind plan, you know?
Yep.
All right. And I suppose the thing I wanted to talk about before we go is this book I read recently. That's not a very good segue, but it's the one you get. This book I found really fascinating. And this, we took last week off, and so maybe we ruined the flow of the last episode into this one. It's actually very funny. So last episode, we covered a book by the name of The Sacred and the Profane. And I got this book recommendation actually from Thomas777. And I enjoyed the book, but and I was recommended the book from another guy in our chat, a good friend of ours. I believe it's Wagner's Ghost, previously Captain Haddock. And he's very much into this sort of thing. There is another Sacred and the Profane book that he was hoping that we would cover. And he was very upset that we covered the wrong one. We covered the run written by Steve Barney. But which they deal in kind of the same thing, but there's one that's much, much more famous, and he was very upset that I got the wrong one. But the other Sacred and the Profane book was written by the author that we're going to talk about today. The author, Mircea Eliade. I'm probably saying this wrong. I hate this, where I should listen to how these names are pronounced beforehand. But it's Mircea Eliade. And the book is titled The Myth of the Eternal Return. And this is a very, very fascinating book. I love this one. It was published in English in 1954. It's been for a while. And it deals in the sort of common threads that unite a lot of sort of cosmological mythology of different cultures around the world. And what unites sort of like the Christian mythology and the Indian mythologies and a lot of these other sort of creation myths. And it kind of finds this bedrock kind of universal functionality of what a lot of these mythologies mean to the societies. And, you know, it is a very, very illuminating book, and it connected a lot of dots from things that we talked about over the past few episodes that deal in more of the esoteric lore of things. And it deals in like how the mind of the ancient man was different than the modern man, and that's a topic we return to a lot. And the importance of spirituality, and not any specific spirituality, but sort of the relationship with the mystical world and how that differs from how we engage with it now. So it starts with this idea that to the ancient man, there were very few profane activities. And as we talked about in the last book, the sacred and the profane, the sacred is the divine, the profane is everything else. Profane is just regular stuff that has no spiritual element to it. It's not special in any way. And he says in the ancient world, there was very little activities a human could do that were actually profane. In the sense that hunting, fishing, sex, they all participated in some way with the sacred or mystical world. They were all kind of ritualistic. They were all kind of touched with divinity. Nothing was really a waste of time. Because it couldn't be, because that would kind of break your mind. We'll get to that in a little bit later, but like everything was kind of special. Everything was sort of ritualistic in a sense. And that's in sort of the practical way, but also in sort of their mythological way. They would say that for all the ancient people, even the Jews, things on earth were represented in the celestial form. It was almost like a Platonic form sort of idea. So this was grounded in the belief that everything that takes place on earth has some representation in the mystical world. So it would follow that any activity would do has some fundamental connection with this other dimension that we cannot see. So that kind of built up this idea that, oh, everything we do matters. Everything we do is important. Nothing we do is really a waste of time. And this, tied into, and we talked about this in the Sacred and the Profane, about, we talked about like the Nephilim and the throne of God, and in the sacred temples, they kind of built their temples. We build our cathedrals to these sort of sacred forms, and the positions of things in the temples correspond to what we believe their position in heaven would be. Like the placement of the throne over here and the tabernacle over here would correspond to what we believe sort of the divine placement of these in, you know, God's throne, right? So, and even in India, the designs of their cities, they believed, were pulled from celestial versions. And he's got a line here. Hold on. He says, "The world that surrounds us, then, the world in which the presence and the work of man are felt, all these have an extraterrestrial archetype, be it conceived as a plan, as a form, or purely and simply as a double existing on a higher cosmic level." We find the same theory in India. All the Indian royal cities, even the modern ones, are built after their mythical model of the celestial city where, in the age of gold, the universal sovereign dwelt. And like the latter, the king attempts to revive the age of gold to make a perfect reign a present reality. So, and we saw this when we were discussing, you know, the founding of ancient cities. There's always this idea that the cities we're founding here are built after some kind of celestial or mystical model, that there was sort of a divinity in finding a city. It wasn't just like in the modern sense a grid where people live, you know. And this is where he gets into his idea where the things that humans do are almost a rebellion against the profane, because the real world is chaos, the real world is punishment, the real world is random and profane, and it just exists to torment us. So it's sort of this mythical chaos. And when we settle it, when we kind of try to bend reality to our own whim, we are almost cosmetizing it through rituals. And it's like when the Vikings settled Greenland, they reenacted their creation myth on the land. Or like the Spanish conquistadors setting up a cross. The moment they break into a new territory, they set up a cross. The idea of like entering a new land, and the first thing you do is build a church. The first thing you do is enact some kind of ritual to like leave your mystical imprint on it, because it's good. That's like placing your order on the chaos of the unknown, and that's what those rituals represented. That's what the founding of a church used to represent. It wasn't just to build a church just to have it. It really signified that you were, you know, implanting your order on a chaotic world. And he's got this line here that I really, really loved. He says, "Each of the examples in the previous chapter reveals the same primitive ontological conception. An object or act only becomes real insofar as it imitates or repeats an archetype. Thus, reality is acquired solely through repetition or participation. Everything which lacks an exemplary model is meaningless, meaning it lacks reality. Men would thus have a tendency to become archetypical and paradigmatic. The tendency may well appear paradoxical in the sense that man of a traditional culture sees himself as real only to the extent when he ceases to be himself and is satisfied with imitating and repeating the gestures of another."
We can see then how the biological instinct for survival evolved into a psychological drive to remain in reality, in the realm of the sacred. But how did archaic man enter the plane of the sacred? Well, his technique for achieving this was, in Eliade's terms, repetition, imitation, and participation. In simple words, since the plane of the sacred contained all life, meaning, and reality, primitive man modeled every aspect of his life after sacred archetypes.
So it's this idea that, you know, I love that idea where like you only feel real when you cease to be human, when you decide to like step outside of yourself and try and engage with the world in a mystical way. And he makes a good line here, and the reason we do this is because the primitive man, or the ancient man, cannot conceive of unprovoked suffering. So you have this idea that the world can't be meaningless. The world can't just be chaos, because then it would just be nihilistic. Then nothing would matter. So suffering and catastrophe and illness has to have some meaning. right? And some people, like a lot of the nihilists of today, would say, oh, you're just deluding yourself that life truly is meaningless. Well, if that was the case, then we wouldn't have people, right? So it actually makes more sense to pretend that, or not pretend, but interpret the world as like the illness and catastrophe and crisis. It's like the force of an enemy. It's someone trying to do something against you. It's trying to attack your order. What you represent is order. You can say the world represents chaos, but chaos is uniquely targeting you. And that's why something is happening to you. It's not random, it's targeted. And it must be contended with, either magically or appealing to the gods. And you even see this in Christianity. This is the idea that suffering is essential. You know, suffering was always essential throughout time. And that's what kind of links Christianity with all these other, even arguably the paganisms, that this idea that suffering is essential to life, it's kind of a crazy idea when you think of it. Like, how did that come about? But this is how it came about, because it's like by you suffering, you become real, and it matters, because if you didn't suffer, you would not represent order. It's kind of a different way of looking at it, but you see this commonality all throughout cultures throughout the world. And he even gives an example of this one god from Indian culture called Tammuz. Hold on. In the Mediterranean Mesopotamian area, man's sufferings were early connected with those of a god. To do so was to endow them with an archetype that gave them both reality and normality. The very ancient myth of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Tammuz has replicas and imitations almost throughout the Paleo-Oriental world, and traces of its scenario were preserved even down to post-Christian Gnosticism. This is not the... hold on. It said, any suffering could be tolerated if the drama of Tammuz was remembered. For this mythical drama reminded men that suffering is never final, that death is always followed by resurrection, that every defeat is annulled and transcended by the final victory. The analogy between the myths and the lunar drama outlined in the preceding chapter is obvious. What we wish to emphasize at this point is that Tammuz, or any other variant of the same archetype, justifies, or rather renders tolerable, the sufferings of the just. The god, as so often the just and the innocent, suffered without being guilty. He was humiliated, flogged till the lash drew blood, imprisoned in a pit, that is, in hell. Here it was that the great goddess visited him, encouraged him, and revived him. So basically he's trying to say that we have these myths where even the just and the innocent suffer, which almost justifies the suffering by saying suffering is usually visited on those who don't deserve it, and that almost justifies the suffering. You see what I'm saying? And that was kind of, and the fact that that finds a place in like Indian culture and in Aboriginal culture and in Christian culture, it's that same sort of myth carried across time, I thought was kind of interesting. And really at the center of the book is this idea of the repetition of the creation myth, and that's where the title comes from, the myth of the eternal return. It's sort of this idea that a lot of our, and we kind of do this even with the calendar year, this idea that we all have a creation myth, and we're always revisiting the creation myth. And in Christianity, the creation myth is sort of the death and rebirth of Jesus Christ. We commemorate that every single year, but that's also commemorated in various solstice rituals. Like the idea of sort of the death and rebirth in a very, very mythological, mystical sense is always, it was almost more literal back then, because you had to experience literal death and literal rebirth, but that by doing that, you almost control death and rebirth. Yeah, he says the sacred rituals, like even of Stone Age primitive cultures, the sacred rituals that they do, sort of a replication of what the gods or mythic heroes did, and we repeat them again and again and again forever. You know, like the Aborigines of like Australia, they would circumcise themselves with stone tools because that's what the gods did. Christians have a day of rest because that's what God did. And all through time, even marriage was a replication of the creation myth, where man represents heaven and woman represents earth, and their marriage is the unity between those. And that's kind of, he goes into quite some detail about how the sexual act was treated as sort of a divine thing too. These days, everything is profane. Sex is meaningless. Sex is just pleasure. But in the ancient world, sex was this, especially if you were like a king or something. But there was always this idea that sex wasn't just this silly, ludicrous thing you did to make yourself feel good. It had some divinity to it.
Where each new year in the traditional conception is a recreation of the world out of chaos. The Babylonians had a calendar of 360 days. At the end of those 360 days, the 4 additional days, were considered out of the year, which is to say that the world had reverted into chaos. And the way they marked that was by allowing Saturnalia. All social roles were dropped. The king was no longer an exalted figure. The peasants and serfs were no longer debased. Sexual license was granted. Riotous drinking and feasting and, quote, partying occurred. And then, on the first day of the next year, the order was reestablished when the king and queen ascended to the top of the ziggurat and had ritual sex, the hierogamy, and recreated order in the world. Every year that occurred. That has not died. Why do we have Saturnalia on New Year's Eve? Why not the night after or the night before? Again, we have seen the year has run its course. There is a sort of cessation of time, allowing us to engage in a formless, orderless, spontaneous eruption of our primordial urges, which is then followed by a rigorous return to order. That, again, is the reason we have New Year's resolutions. Because the sense is each year is a new year, with new potentialities, with new possibilities. We wipe free the burden of the last year. That's over, it's gone. Yeah, it's true I couldn't lose weight last year, but this year is going to be a different year.
We talked about this when we were discussing, the ancient religions of the Middle East, about how men and women were viewed, as chaos versus order. And we still kind of see that now in the modern discourse on men versus women. But in the ancient world, it was much more clear that man was order, woman was chaos, but you kind of needed those two together. They didn't make sense apart. You can't just have order without chaos. And so the idea of that even being represented in sex, the conjoining of those two things was, that wouldn't seem that bizarre to the ancient mind. And it would seem bizarre to us because everything in the modern world is profane. Everything is meaningless. Nothing means anything. Everything is random. We have accepted that nothing means anything, and any ritual that we have is just wasting our time. But then we also wonder why, we keep killing ourselves, right? Because it turns out that maybe you need this stuff. Maybe you need, and we might quibble over what that religion is, what that specific spirituality is, but the idea that you need something that allows you to interface with the mystical world and make these things you do matter on a larger scale, like, you kind of need that, because I don't think the suicide rate was something they really had to worry about back then,
Yeah.
He's got this line here that I really love, and where he says the repetition of divine creation in these rituals, like the yearly ritual that you would have to honor the creation of the universe. Because a lot of these cultures have very similar creation myths. A lot of them center around a mountain that's depicted as like the navel of the world. You have aspects of the universe that take on, the aspects of childbirth and things like that. This idea that when we celebrate our creation myths, when we celebrate these acts of death and rebirth, it's a rebellion against profane time. And just like we were talking about, when you go to a new area and you build a church, or you found a city, or you place a cross, or you make a sacrifice, that's a rebellion against profane space. You're abolishing profanity by building something divine there. And in a sense, you're rebelling against the slow, deathly march of time by honoring this creation myth that lets you kind of stand outside of a punishing universe. Like he said, the archaic man does not enjoy profane history and is frequently trying to break it. And that's one thing I found when we look into the various ways that humans have attempted to interface with the mystical world. It's like we're almost trying to break the universe every time we do it. You know, we are aware of gods, God or gods. And what do we try and do? Well, we actually try and control the gods. We try to appeal to the gods. Sometimes we try and trick the gods, as the Jews do. But all throughout history, like, we're always trying to figure out how to, like, understand gods, understand ghosts, understand demons, and manipulate them for our own ends. So, like, this core aspect of, maybe not all humans, but most humans, is like being aware of the mystical world, but then almost trying to, like, manipulate and break it. And I found that that doesn't get brought up a lot, I don't think, but I found that interesting. And in a sense, these rituals that we employ, we're trying to break time. We don't like how the universe is, so we try and control it in these senses. And he's got this line here. It says, the abolition of profane time and the individual's projection into mythical time do not occur, of course, except at essential periods. Those, that is, when the individual is truly himself, on the occasion of rituals or of important acts, generation, ceremonies, hunting, fishing, war, work. The rest of his life is passed in profane time, which is without meaning, in the state of becoming. Brahmic texts clearly bring out the heterogeneity of these two times, the sacred and the profane, on the modality of the gods, which is coupled with the immortality and the modality of man. Insofar as he repeats the archetypical sacrifice, the sacrificer, in full ceremonial action, abandons the profane world of mortals and introduces himself into the divine world of the immortals. So it's this idea that these rituals are us, like, breaking free from our world, and we have to do this every single year, and that is what we repeat every time. That's the myth of the eternal return. It's always every year revisiting this creation myth as a way to make sense of the universe, but also, you know, give meaning to everything. And it's not to give meaning, it was the assumption that things had meaning. It was the assumption that by, like, controlling creation, we had some control over time. And it wasn't a form of us tricking ourselves. It was just a true belief. And once we lose that, you know, again, it seems that just nihilism creeps in. He's got this thing here. Readers familiar with ethnography and the history of religions are well aware of the importance of a whole series of periodic ceremonies, which, for convenience, we can group under two main headings. Number one, the annual expulsion of demons, diseases, and sins, or two, rituals of the days preceding and following the new year. In broad outline, the ceremony of expelling demons, diseases, and sins can be reduced to the following elements: fasting, ablutions, and purifications, extinguishing the fire and ritually rekindling it in the second part of the ceremonial, expulsion of demons by means of noises, cries, or blows, followed by their pursuit through the village with uproar and hullabaloo. This expulsion can be practiced under the form of the ritual sending away of the animal, the scapegoat, or of a man, or like an actual human sacrifice. There are often ceremonial combats between two groups of actors, or collective orgies, or processions of masked men. In many places, the belief still survives that at the time of these manifestations, the souls of the dead approach the houses of the living, who respectfully go out to meet them and lavish honors upon them for several days. You still kind of see this in Japan, a lot of places. You see this in Mexico, celebrations of the dead, these ceremonies where they literally interface with the world. And this is All Hallows Eve. You know, there's lots of pagan rituals that do something like this. Like, this is evident everywhere. And, you know, there's a purpose of that in the form of death and rebirth, of sort of like living in that space where the two meet so you can begin the year again new. And kind of like by embodying the creation myth, you are kind of playing God for a second and starting off the new year in a new way. And they all seem to fall around the same time. Not exactly the same time, because Chinese New Year kind of, there's different days and different specific dates, but it's around that time of the season where these all seem to fall. Actually, there is an example, just to give some context of how the Japanese do it here. Hold on. It says, at the same time, Japanese tradition has preserved the memory of a conception that is connected with the ceremonial of a year's end, using the findings of the Japanese ethnographer Dr. Masaoka. situates the ceremonials of the secret societies in what he calls the Tama complex. This Tama is a spiritual substance that is found in man, in the souls of the dead, and in the holy men, and that when winter passes on to spring, becomes agitated and attempts to leave the body. And the ceremony is to prevent the forsaking of the body by the Tama, that according to the interpretation, the festival is designed to hold or fix this spiritual substance or celebrate it. So it's literally ceremonies to like make it so the soul doesn't like leave your body. So these oftentimes are still practiced to this day in certain regions, but they were practiced a lot more back. And so the question is like, why do we do this? Why does this happen at all? It says the required death and rebirth, that is the eternal return. And what it teaches us is that no event is irreversible and no transformation is final. We can control and exist outside of time by forcing a rebirth in the mythic universe. And so it's about control and not being held captive by time itself. And he's got this line here. He says, this eternal return reveals this eternal return reveals an ontology uncontaminated by time and becoming, just as the Greeks in their myth of the eternal return sought to satisfy their metaphysical thirst for the ontic and the static. Even so, the primitive, by conferring a cyclic direction upon time, annuls its irreversibility. So it's like the very creation of cyclical time itself, because there was a time before this concept of cyclical time, and some people think that cyclical time is, an inferior way of looking at time. And the Indians and the Hindus, they're obsessed with cyclical time. Everything is cycles. Everything is cycles within cycles. And at various times, I've pushed back against that. Like I don't like the idea of cyclical time, or I think there's a better way to conceptualize time. I'm a bit more cynical, and I see it as a downward trajectory. And a lot of the esotericists believe that too. But one thing that this idea of cyclical time, this innovation, granted us with is this idea that nothing is permanent, that there's always a way. The very idea of resurrection itself almost springs from this idea of cyclical time, that no matter how bad things are, there is an inevitable rebirth, that no matter how bad things are now, there is this inevitable victory, there is this inevitable end to the madness, and you can begin again. And that concept itself, living in your mind, kind of changes how you interface with the world. Nothing is static in that sense, but even though things are cyclical, that can seem like a prison in some way. But if you think of the cyclical as just embedded within that, there is a resurrection, that's kind of liberating. And I never really thought of it like that before. And I think that we in the modern day, we've lost that as well. We don't think there's such thing as a rebirth. There is no like final moment where we can be free of all this prison, And because of that, that's why the suicide rate's so fucking high, maybe. And really, the underlying thing, the reason we do that, is that he makes the claim in the book, is that we're always trying to escape history. We actually don't want to be imprisoned by history. We want to think that we can exist outside of it. And he makes a claim that in the modern world, we have a Hegelian view of history. We have historicism rather. And it's this idea that we're always confronting history. We're always staring at our own history in the face. We can never escape our history. We're always, obsessing about the history and trying to engage in various dialectics to make sense of the history. And we're never free of it. So his claim was that these things that we might have thought were silly or ridiculous in the past, or, the idea of cyclical time was a prison, not really. Our modern view of history is a prison. It's something that we can never escape, and we always must be confronting every single day. And that by losing the literal nature of these ceremonies, these rituals, and these creation myths, it's like we can never transcend, our material conditions, and we're always going to feel trapped. We're always going to feel like we're imprisoned by our own history, by our own everything. I think that's a important demarcation between the modern man and the ancient man, whereas the ancient man might have very well been freer, even though we think he was trapped by rituals. Those rituals liberated him. those rituals allowed him to transcend the universe in a way that's just lacking with us. And even though in an almost hyper real way we keep going through these rituals, we keep doing the same rituals over and over again, we don't really believe them. We just think it's just another thing that imprisons us. And by the way, is anything I'm saying making any sense? You find is this following?
No, really, for sure. I'm always kind of frustrated that this type of thinking is qualified as like esoteric or maybe like new age or something, when to me this is just like fundamental global human spirituality or something like that. Like it's your connection to cycles and nature and history and the earth and the universe and whatever else. Like it doesn't matter where you come out at, these are important elements for an individual to incorporate into their life daily. Or else it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, you feel rudderless and alone. And it's funny to me listening to Catholics and atheists and pagans and prots argue about theology. And it's like, I'm technically a Protestant. I don't give a fuck about theology. I don't even go to church. I don't care. I'm still struggling with the actual important part, which is the spiritual part, like the metaphysical, the important part, you know? And that to me, it's really interesting to hear these takes on it, because it's like they almost seem to have had, in some of these historical cases, a much simpler quote-unquote theology, but a much stronger spiritual connection as a group.
Yeah. It's funny that, you know, even in Christianity, some people, it seems so obvious, but people ignore it. Like within Christianity, you're always looking towards the judgment day. And what is the judgment day? The judgment day is essentially when everything will rebalance and permanently rebalance. And despite, you know, everything that's happened, it'll all be good. And we kind of build our yearly cycle around that. And the death and resurrection of Christ is kind of like a mini creation judgment day cyclical rebalancing myth that, you know, if you look at it so closely, you kind of forget that's what it is. But, you know, and he's got this line here about, you know, the problem presented by historicism that we were just talking about. And I like the phrase he uses here. It's for our purpose, only one question concerns us. How can the terror of history be tolerated from the viewpoint of historicism? Justification of a historical event by the simple fact that it is a historical event, in other words, by the simple fact that it happened that way, will not go far towards freeing humanity from the terror that the event inspires. So I just like that. Like, you're being held captive by history, by the literal nature of history. You can never ever transcend it. And he mentions in the book repeatedly that the Hindus and other cultures, he described it as a refusal of history, like an ultimate rebellion against your own history, allowing you to fully transcend it and approach the future in a more pure way. And that's what the creation myth does. Like, death and birth are combined into one creation myth. Like, that's what it is. It's 1 year ending and another year beginning. It's death and rebirth all at once. And when you celebrate that, you're stepping outside of time. You're entering into this like fucking plasma of the universe where death and life are, and time stops and everything is the same. And then you start the new year again. But you can start fresh. You can start with a different sort of energy than always being shackled to your past. And because it's like metaphysics itself is a refusal of history. And if you can never unshackle yourself from the history, you can never transcend into anything, you know, above your current materialist position. And then you'll put your spirit, that's essentially what Marxism is. It's trying to take that spiritual, the seeking of divinity, and code that directly into materialism. And that's why people go so insane. The deeper you get into Marxism, you try and chase spirituality deeper and deeper and deeper into basic materialism. And that's how you get like Slavoj Zizek. That's how you get like the really, really kooky stuff where it's like you're looking at DNA and seeing like you're like your only ontology is gender dynamics. It's really weird shit, but that's what they're
like gays are the only real women or some shit. I forget.
Yeah, that's how you get to like
wild.
That's how you get to homosexuality is really the only creation method. It's like that only makes sense if you're trying to chase chase God into fucking materialism. like the exact inverse of what you should be doing. Anyway, I would highly recommend this book, The Myth of the Eternal Return. There's a lot of examples in here. I only gave a few. I gave the Christianity, and he talks about the Stoics. He talks about Indians. He talks about various Aboriginal cultures, Stone Age cultures. But we talked about Stone Age cultures in our previous episode, so I didn't want to spend too much time in that. But I just wanted to, I think this was essential to kind of explain when we talk about Paleolithic cultures, when we go back further and further in time. I think you need to contextualize their relationship with the divine, with their religion, because that was the belief that a lot of modern historians had up until like the 70s or the 80s, was that the cavemen, the Paleolithic man, their relationship with art was very surface level. Their relationship with hunting and gathering was very materialistic, that they didn't have these higher minded or spiritual value sets. And what they found was, that's not what it is at all. They were probably more spiritual, and their relationship with the world was probably more dynamic than ours. Anyway, I just thought that was a great way to sort of cap off our discussion on these various civilizations throughout time. And
yeah, that's cool.
I hope people like that. I can't recommend that. I hope I did this book justice, because there's a lot of very, very passionate people, and I got knives coming at me for doing the sacred and the profane book.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.